Let me tell you a story about how a seemingly small detail can unravel an entire marriage and, in doing so, thrust you into a life you never anticipated. My name is Adam. I'm just an ordinary guy, a little over 30, and I've been married for several years. At some point, though, my wife, let's call her Lisa, started behaving strangely. She began staying late at work, always buried under projects, or so she claimed. When she did come home, she was in unusually cheerful moods, often skipping dinner, and carrying herself with an air of arrogance that felt completely out of character. The more I observed, the clearer it became something was off. The puzzle pieces fit too well. The late nights, the unexplained happiness, and the sudden dismissive attitude. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was convinced Lisa was cheating. I just needed solid proof. Determined to catch her in the act, I decided to investigate personally. One evening, I drove to her office, parked at a discreet distance, and waited. It wasn't long before she emerged, accompanied by none other than her boss, a well-known figure in our small town. They got into his car, and instinct took over. I followed them. The trail led to a local hotel. My heart pounded as I watched them disappear inside. I held back near the reception, uncertain of my next move, until I noticed a friendly-looking hotel staff member. With a bit of persuasive negotiation and a generous cash incentive, I got exactly what I needed, her room number and even the specific windows belonging to their suite. I slipped around to the back of the hotel, already knowing what tool would come in handy. From the trunk of my car, I pulled out my drone, something that had proven useful more times than I cared to admit. Setting it up with practiced ease, I launched it toward the designated windows. And there they were. Behind sheer curtains, Lisa and her boss indulged in a full-blown romantic affair. Champagne, fruit, chocolate, the whole seduction routine. I watched in silent agony, my stomach churning, but I kept the drone recording. Then things escalated. They moved on to an intimate phase so explicit that even the most daring adult films might hesitate to depict it. My hands trembled, but I didn't stop filming. Watching my own wife in the arms of another man, a man much older and more powerful, was beyond gut-wrenching. But I needed this evidence. Once they were done, I didn't linger. Numb and disoriented, I made my way home, barely registering the drive. My body operated on autopilot, but my mind was a storm of emotions. Seated in my living room, phone in hand, I stared at the undeniable proof of betrayal. Confronting Lisa directly felt futile. And as for her boss, that was even more dangerous. He was a man of influence, always surrounded by bodyguards. Any confrontation could easily end with me beaten senseless. So I took a different approach. If I couldn't confront him, maybe his wife could. Yes, he was married, and his wife, let's call her Susan, was no ordinary woman. She owned a successful local advertising agency. Without hesitation, I made my way to her office, the incriminating video file tucked securely in my pocket. When Susan greeted me, she exuded class and confidence. She was older than me, but carried herself with an effortless grace that was almost intimidating. Surprisingly, she welcomed me warmly, offering coffee before we settled into conversation. As we spoke, I quickly realized she was in the dark about her husband's ways. She had been married to him for 2 decades and knew all about his long history of affairs. Younger women, he'd lure them in, enjoy the thrill for a while, then discard them like yesterday's news once the novelty wore off. With a calm, almost sympathetic tone, she told me, "You're Lisa? She's just another temporary conquest. He'll tire of her soon, and when he does, she'll be left with nothing." Susan didn't seem angry. If anything, she felt pity for Lisa, knowing full well that not only would she be replaced, but she'd likely lose her job in the process. She understood the devastation I was experiencing, but made it clear there was little she could do. However, she did offer one thing. She was willing to buy the footage from me for her own private reasons, and she strongly advised me against confronting her husband directly. That was the moment I realized I had walked into something much bigger than just my marriage falling apart. He would probably just mock me, maybe even get aggressive. Susan told me it wasn't worth the confrontation, and I trusted her judgment. Strangely, Talking to her had a calming effect on me. So, without hesitation, I handed over the video and headed home. By the time I arrived, Lisa was already back from work. The contrast between her and Susan hit me like a brick wall. Lisa, with her arrogance and deception, seemed so shallow compared to the poised, genuine woman I had just met. Without saying much, I showed Lisa the drone footage. She lost it, screaming at the top of her lungs. She called me worthless, claiming I would never amount to anything. She even had the audacity to brag about how her affair would elevate her into a life of luxury. Then, without hesitation, she grabbed a suitcase and stormed out. I didn't try to stop her. No shouting, no pleading. At that moment, she probably thought I was weak, too pathetic to fight for my marriage. But from where I stood, I finally understood she wasn't worth the battle. And just like that, a new chapter in my life began. I found myself spending more and more time with Susan. We connected in a way I never expected. Despite my ordinary background in tech and her standing as a powerful businesswoman, none of that seemed to matter. We walked the city streets, shared casual meals, sometimes just grabbing fast food. And through it all, she carried herself with grace and authenticity. I couldn't help but think, maybe I could be the man she needed. Lisa and I divorced swiftly. Not long after, her high-powered boss lost interest, dumping her without a second thought. He didn't just leave her, he fired her, stripping away the security she had been so eager to flaunt. She ended up struggling, bouncing between couches and barely scraping by in a tiny rented room. At one point, she even tried to worm her way back into my life. But when that failed, she resorted to openly bragging about her infidelity, as if it were some kind of twisted achievement. I couldn't even begin to understand that mindset, but honestly, I no longer cared. Meanwhile, Susan was finalizing her own divorce. Her husband had learned that I was the man behind the incriminating footage and wanted revenge. But Susan shut him down swiftly, warning him that if he made a move against me, she would expose his shady financial dealings. In the end, everything was settled in court, and she emerged unscathed financially. But that wasn't what made her special to me. She was simply an incredible person. Eventually, we moved in together, building a life grounded in honesty and trust. Susan had a teenage son, and surprisingly, we bonded quickly. Ironically, Lisa's former boss hadn't been much of a father figure to him anyway. Maybe that turned out to be a blessing in disguise. When I think back to Lisa now, I feel a bit of pity for her. She made her choices, and they led her down a rough path. But as for me, I found something real. I found love, and I don't regret a single thing. In the end, that one seemingly insignificant detail, her betrayal, was a push I needed to break free and find the happiness I truly deserved.